I knew the HOA was bad, but I didn't realize they were cartoon-level evil until they tried to ban my wheelchair ramp. It started on a Tuesday morning. I had just finished installing the custom-built ramp leading from our front door to the driveway. My wife, Delilah Von Zeller, had taken a fall a few months back, and while she was recovering well, she still needed a wheelchair for longer distances. The ramp made things easier for her, and honestly, I didn't think much of it. It wasn't some eyesore, it was a sleek, sturdy ramp that blended in with the house. But of course, the HOA always had to find something to complain about. Right on cue, the self-appointed queen of our neighborhood, Meredith Calloway, waddled up our driveway, her clipboard clutched in her perfectly manicured claws. Meredith had been running the HOA for the past 5 years like it was her personal kingdom, and she had a vendetta against anything that didn't fit her aesthetic. Waylon, she huffed, her sharp eyes locking onto the ramp like it had personally insulted her. This is unacceptable. I leaned against the porch railing, pretending I had all the time in the world. Good morning to you too, Meredith. What's unacceptable? She gestured dramatically at the ramp as if it were some kind of monstrosity. This structure violates HOA Code 27-B. All exterior modifications must be pre-approved by the board, and I don't recall approving this. I crossed my arms. It's a wheelchair ramp, Meredith. My wife needs it. She smiled in that condescending way she always did when she thought she had the upper hand. I understand, Waylon, but rules are rules. You'll need to remove it by the end of the week. I let out a slow breath, forcing myself to stay calm. That's not happening. Meredith's smile faltered for a second before she regained her composure. Then you'll be facing fines. And if those fines aren't paid, we may have to pursue legal action. I stared at her, half expecting her to start twirling a mustache. You really want to take legal action over a wheelchair ramp? She tilted her head. It's about maintaining property values. If we allow one person to break the rules, then where does it stop? Someone else might decide they want to park an RV in their front yard or paint their house neon green. I couldn't help but laugh. You're comparing a medical necessity to an RV and a neon greenhouse? Meredith pursed her lips. Rules are rules, Waylon. You have until Friday. She turned on her heel and marched back down the driveway, already scribbling something on her clipboard. I watched her go, shaking my head. She had no idea who she was messing with. Because while I might be just some guy with a toolbox, my wife, she was the governor. And she was already in the process of revising the very laws Meredith thought she could use against us. As soon as Meredith disappeared down the street, I pulled out my phone and dialed Delilah. She picked up on the second ring. Without wasting time, I explained exactly what had just gone down. She listened quietly, and when I finished, there was a brief pause before she exhaled sharply. Unbelievable, she muttered. They really think they can pull this nonsense? I could practically hear her brain shifting into gear, already calculating the best way to dismantle this ridiculous power play. They think they're above the law, I said, watching Meredith disappear around the corner of the cul-de-sac. But they're about to learn they're not. Delilah's voice took on that cool, measured tone she always had when she was about to go to war. I'll handle this. Just leave the ramp exactly where it is. I grinned. Wouldn't dream of touching it. That evening, Delilah sat at the dining table, her laptop open as she scrolled through municipal codes and state accessibility laws. Her fingers moved quickly over the trackpad, occasionally pausing to jot down notes. They've got nothing, she said after a while, shaking her head. The Americans with Disabilities Act overrides any HOA policy that restricts necessary accommodations. They can't legally force us to remove the ramp. I leaned against the counter, watching her work. But that won't stop them from trying. She nodded, clicking on another document. No, it won't. But they just made a mistake going after us. Because I've been working with state legislators on a bill that expands accessibility protections in HOA communities. That got my attention. You never mentioned that. She shot me a knowing look. I didn't think it would come up this personally. The next morning, I woke up to an official violation notice taped to the front door. Meredith must have been up at the crack of dawn to leave it. I ripped it down and scanned the paper. They were fining us $500 for an unauthorized structural modification and threatening further penalties if we didn't comply. Delilah read over my shoulder, letting out a quiet laugh. They're digging their own grave. She pulled out her phone and made a call. 2 hours later, a sharply dressed attorney named Marcus Langley arrived at our house. He was a friend of Delilah's from her time as a district attorney, and he had a reputation for tearing apart weak legal arguments. After we brought him up to speed, he chuckled. This is textbook HOA overreach. I'll draft a formal response citing federal and state protections. If they push further, we'll take them to court and they'll lose. Delilah nodded. I also want a public record of this. Let's get the media involved. Marcus grinned. Oh, they're going to hate that. By the afternoon, Delilah had contacted a local news station. They sent over a reporter who filmed a segment right on our front lawn. As soon as the story aired, the neighborhood group chat exploded. Residents were furious. Many had their own grievances with the HOA, and this was the final straw. That evening, Meredith showed up at our door again, her expression carefully neutral. Delilah answered the door, arms crossed. Meredith cleared her throat. There's been some misunderstanding. Perhaps we can come to an agreement. Delilah tilted her head. The only agreement is that the ramp stays. Meredith hesitated. Well, the board. Delilah cut her off. The board is about to face legal action. And public scrutiny. And possibly state intervention if they don't back down. For the first time, Meredith looked uncertain. Delilah smiled, but there was no warmth in it. You picked the wrong fight. Meredith's usual confidence wavered as she stood on our porch, confronted by the weight of reality. The HOA had overstepped and now they were cornered. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, then recovered, attempting to regain control with a forced smile. There's no need for legal action, she said, carefully choosing her words. Perhaps we can discuss a compromise. Delilah met her gaze with an unwavering expression. There is no compromise on accessibility. Meredith shifted her stance. The board is willing to reconsider the fine. But the ramp's appearance, perhaps it could be modified to blend better with the neighborhood. Delilah didn't so much as blink. You don't get to dictate how medical accommodations look. The law is clear. And since you're so concerned about neighborhood aesthetics, let me remind you this isn't about appearance. It's about control. Meredith tightened her grip on the clipboard she always carried, but she was losing ground fast. She had walked into this confrontation expecting resistance, but she hadn't anticipated that Delilah would be 2 steps ahead. Before she could respond, a car pulled up in front of the house. A woman in a navy suit stepped out, her presence commanding immediate attention. Meredith Calloway? She asked, closing the car door behind her. Meredith straightened, clearly recognizing authority when she saw it. Yes. The woman extended a folder. You've been officially notified of an investigation into the HOA's compliance with federal accessibility laws. Meredith's face paled. Excuse me. Delilah finally allowed herself a small, satisfied nod. This is Helen Carter, senior investigator for the state's Office of Housing Compliance. Helen didn't waste time. We received a complaint regarding discriminatory enforcement of HOA policies. Your attempt to fine a resident for an ADA-compliant structure is a direct violation of federal law. Failure to immediately rescind the violation could result in significant penalties against the HOA. Meredith's lips parted, but no words came out. Delilah continued, her voice calm and deliberate. You wanted to play hardball. Now you're facing an official investigation. And given the number of homeowners who have grievances against your board, I suspect this won't be the only violation uncovered. The realization sank in. Meredith had pushed too far, and now the entire HOA was under scrutiny. Helen didn't wait for Meredith to respond. You'll need to provide full documentation of all fines and enforcement actions issued in the past 3 years. If there's a pattern of selective enforcement, the HOA could face legal repercussions. Meredith swallowed hard, her earlier bravado completely gone. This is unnecessary. Helen cut her off. That's not your decision. The investigation is already in motion. For the first time since this battle had begun, Meredith looked like she truly understood the consequences. She had wielded power unchecked for years, but now she was facing real accountability. Delilah watched her carefully. You have 2 choices: comply with the investigation and remove the violation, or continue fighting and watch your entire HOA board get dismantled under legal scrutiny. Meredith's fingers twitched around her clipboard. She was calculating, searching for an escape. But there wasn't one. Finally, she exhaled sharply. I'll need to speak with the board. Helen nodded. Do that. But understand the stalling will only make things worse. Meredith turned on her heel and left without another word, her usual smugness completely shattered. The moment she disappeared down the street, Helen closed her folder and turned to Delilah. That should put an end to this nonsense. Delilah's expression remained composed, but the weight of the moment was not lost on her. They won't give up easily. But they've lost their leverage. Helen nodded. Let me know if they attempt anything else. As she left, I let out a slow breath and turned to Delilah. That was satisfying to watch. She gave a small smile. They thought they could push people around forever. That ends now. And just like that, the tide had turned. By the following morning, the entire neighborhood was buzzing. The news report had spread like wildfire, and suddenly people who had spent years quietly accepting the HOA's nonsense were coming out of the woodwork. Meredith's iron grip on the community was slipping, and she knew it. I stepped outside to grab the paper and immediately noticed a few neighbors gathered near the mailbox cluster. They weren't just chatting idly, they were discussing the HOA. The usual hushed tones that accompanied complaints were gone. People were openly venting their frustrations, something that would have been unthinkable a week ago. As I approached, a man named Greg Mullen, who lived 3 doors down, waved me over. He was a retired firefighter, the kind of guy who usually kept his head down to avoid unnecessary conflict. But today, he looked like he had something to say. He wasted no time getting to the point. "Waylon, I saw the news. I can't believe they pulled the stunt with your wife. But honestly, I'm not surprised." A woman named Carla, who had been feuding with the HOA over the color of her shutters for months, crossed her arms. "They've been doing this for years. Finding people for nonsense, making up rules as they go. But this is next level." Greg nodded. "If they're willing to go after the governor's family, what's stopping them from steamrolling the rest of us?" That was the real question, wasn't it? The HOA had spent years enforcing arbitrary rules under the guise of preserving property values. But in reality, it was about control. Meredith had run the board like her personal fiefdom, and until now, no one had dared challenge her. But the tide was turning. Before I could respond, a car pulled up, an expensive luxury sedan with tinted windows. The door swung open, and out stepped a man in a tailored suit. He had the polished look of a corporate lawyer, complete with an air of practiced indifference. He adjusted his cufflinks before addressing the group. "Good morning. My name is Richard Henshaw, legal counsel for the HOA. I'd like to speak with Waylon Zeller privately." The small crowd around me stiffened. This was new. The HOA had never sent in a lawyer just to talk to a homeowner. They must have realized they were in trouble. I didn't flinch. "If you've got something to say, you can say it here." Richard barely reacted. He just offered a thin smile. "Very well. The board is willing to drop the fines and rescind the violation notice regarding the wheelchair ramp. In return, we'd appreciate your cooperation in discouraging further media attention." Ah, there it was. Damage control. I took a slow breath, keeping my expression neutral. "So, let me get this straight. The HOA is willing to back down, but only if we keep quiet." Richard's tone remained smooth. "I wouldn't phrase it that way. We simply believe it's in everyone's best interest to resolve this matter without unnecessary escalation." Carla let out a sharp laugh. "Unnecessary escalation? You people tried to fine a disabled woman for needing a ramp." Greg crossed his arms. "And now that you're under investigation, you suddenly want to play nice?" Richard didn't acknowledge them. His focus remained entirely on me. "Mr. Zeller, the board is prepared to offer an official apology provided we can agree to move forward without further negative press." I tilted my head slightly. "You're not offering an apology because you think you were wrong. You're offering it because you got caught." For the first time, Richard's polished demeanor faltered just a bit. "That's not." I cut him off. "No deal." Silence settled over the group. Richard's jaw tightened, but he recovered quickly. "I see. Then I hope you understand that continued conflict will only prolong this situation." I met his gaze without blinking. "You should be more worried about what happens when the rest of the neighborhood starts pushing back." Richard held my stare for a moment longer, then gave a slight nod. "Very well. If you change your mind, you know where to reach me." He turned and walked back to his car, leaving behind a group of increasingly furious homeowners. Greg let out a low whistle. "They're panicking." Carla nodded. "And they should be." The rest of the day was a blur of phone calls and strategy discussions. Delilah was already working with legal experts to ensure the investigation into the HOA remained thorough. But what surprised me most was the groundswell of support from the neighborhood. That evening, we gathered in our backyard. Nearly 30 people showed up, more than I'd ever seen at any HOA meeting. A woman named Teresa, who had been fighting an absurd fine over her flower beds, spoke first. "We've spent years dealing with their nonsense. Fines, threats, rule changes whenever it suited them. But now, they finally have to answer for it." Greg added, "We need to push for real change. Not just getting rid of Meredith, we need new rules, new leadership. If we don't act now, they'll just regroup and find another way to tighten their grip. It was Delilah who finally laid out the plan. The HOA has controlled this neighborhood for too long, but they only have power if we allow it. The board positions are elected. If we rally enough homeowners, we can vote them out and replace them with people who actually represent the community. A murmur of agreement spread through the crowd. Carla grinned. So we're not just taking down Meredith. We're taking down the whole corrupt system. Delilah nodded. That's exactly what we're doing. And just like that, the real fight began. The next morning, the HOA's desperation became painfully obvious. Someone had plastered notices on nearly every mailbox in the neighborhood, claiming that misinformation was being spread about the board. The message was nothing more than a panicked attempt at damage control, urging residents not to fall for the sensationalism being pushed by outside influences. Residents weren't buying it. If anything, it only fueled the fire. People were talking openly now, and more stories of the HOA's abuses were surfacing. A retired teacher down the street shared how she had been fined repeatedly for the height of her hedges, despite there being no clear rule about it. A young couple revealed that Meredith had blocked their request to install solar panels, citing aesthetic concerns even though multiple homes had them already. The dam had broken. By noon, Greg and Carla had organized a petition to demand a community vote on the HOA leadership. Within hours, over half the neighborhood had signed. Even residents who had once been indifferent were realizing that if they didn't act now, the abuse would continue. While this was happening, Delilah was making moves of her own. She had scheduled a meeting with a state regulatory board, ensuring that the investigation into the HOA's practices wouldn't be brushed aside. The legal weight behind her efforts meant that even if the HOA thought they could weasel their way out of this, they were mistaken. Then came the escalation. Around mid-afternoon, a man in a maintenance uniform arrived at our house carrying a clipboard. He knocked on the door, looking uncomfortable. I stepped outside, arms crossed. He hesitated before speaking. I was sent by the HOA. They told me I needed to inspect the ramp for compliance. It was a weak attempt at intimidation. They were trying to find some technicality to cling to, hoping they could still force us to remove it. I didn't move. You can tell whoever sent you that the ramp meets ADA requirements, and if they want to push this, they'll be dealing with a lawsuit. The man shifted awkwardly, clearly just doing his job. I figured. I'll let them know. He left without even glancing at the ramp. They were grasping at straws, and they knew it. The final blow came later that evening when a group of homeowners confronted Meredith directly. She had been avoiding people all day, likely realizing that her control was slipping. But when she stepped outside to retrieve her mail, she found herself surrounded by angry residents. Greg, standing at the front of the group, spoke first. He didn't yell. He didn't need to. His voice was firm, steady, and full of quiet fury. We're calling a vote to remove the board. Meredith's face tightened. That's not how things work. Carla held up the petition. Actually, it is. We have the signatures. Enough to force a vote. The air grew thick with tension. Meredith had always ruled through intimidation and bureaucracy, but now she was being stripped of both. The usual tactics wouldn't work anymore. She glanced around at the gathered homeowners, clearly calculating. You don't understand the complexities of running this community. These decisions aren't made lightly. A man from the back of the group spoke up. You fine my mother for leaving her trash bins out an hour past pickup time, but let your friend repaint her house an unapproved color. That's not complex. That's corruption. Murmurs of agreement spread through the crowd. Meredith straightened, trying to regain control. If you go through with this, you'll regret it. The HOA maintains order. Without us, property values will plummet. You'll see. Her words didn't have the effect she intended. People weren't afraid anymore. Greg took a step forward. We'll take our chances. Meredith's jaw tightened, but she knew she had lost. The vote was happening, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. As she turned and stormed back inside, the neighborhood erupted into conversation. Plans were being made. People were already discussing who would take over once the board was dissolved. Delilah, standing beside me, watched it all unfold with a knowing expression. They thought they were untouchable, she said. They were wrong. And just like that, the HOA's reign was coming to an end. The petition had been filed, the vote was scheduled, and the neighborhood was buzzing with anticipation. Meredith and her inner circle were visibly on edge, their usual air of superiority replaced with tight-lipped tension. For the first time in years, they were the ones on the defensive, scrambling to keep their grip on the community. The night before the vote, Delilah and I sat on the back porch, watching the distant glow of porch lights flicker across the neighborhood. She had spent the day finalizing her work with the state's housing officials, ensuring that even if the HOA managed to pull some last-minute stunt, legal oversight would be in place. She rested her coffee mug on the table, her gaze steady. They'll try something tomorrow. They won't just roll over and let this happen. I nodded. Probably, but they don't have the numbers anymore. The neighborhood's done with them. She tapped a finger lightly against the mug, considering. They might try procedural tricks. Delay the meeting, claim the petition wasn't valid. Anything to stall. I exhaled, stretching out my legs. Then we don't give them room to breathe. We show up in full force, make sure they can't sweep this under the rug. The next morning, the HOA's last-ditch effort to cling to power became clear. An email had gone out in emergency notice claiming that the vote had been postponed due to administrative issues. It was a blatant lie, and they knew it. Greg called me not long after. His voice crackled with frustration. They're saying the signatures need to be re-verified. Convenient, isn't it? I glanced at Delilah, who was already pulling up legal documents on her laptop. We're not playing their game. The vote happens today with or without them. By midday, a crowd had gathered in front of the HOA's meeting hall, a beige community center that had served as the board's personal throne room for years. It was packed. More people than I'd ever seen at an HOA event. The usual mood of forced civility was gone, replaced by something far more determined. Meredith was inside, flanked by her remaining allies on the board. Richard, the HOA's lawyer, stood with them, arms crossed as he spoke in hushed tones. They were clearly trying to come up with a way to salvage their crumbling authority. Unfortunately for them, the neighborhood had already made up its mind. Delilah stepped up to the front of the crowd, her voice carrying over the murmurs. The board is trying to delay the vote, but the rules are clear. We met the requirements, we followed the process, and the neighborhood has the right to decide its leadership. Someone in the crowd called out, "They can't stall forever." She nodded. No, they can't. And they won't. Because we're voting right here, right now. The announcement sent a ripple through the crowd. Greg and Carla stepped forward, distributing printed ballots that had already been prepared in case of exactly this scenario. Inside, Meredith and Richard had finally realized they were out of time. Meredith stepped out, her expression carefully neutral, but her hands gripping her clipboard a little too tightly. She raised a hand, trying to project authority. This meeting has not been officially sanctioned. Any vote held outside of the HOA's established procedures will not be recognized. Delilah didn't even hesitate. Then you can take it up with the State Housing Board. Because I already confirmed with them this vote is valid. And any attempt to suppress it will be considered interference. Richard shifted uncomfortably, clearly realizing that this was a battle they couldn't win. Meredith's face tightened. You're making a mistake. Delilah didn't blink. The only mistake was letting this HOA operate unchecked for so long. The vote proceeded. One by one, homeowners cast their ballots. Each slip of paper another nail in the coffin of the HOA's reign. When the final count was tallied, the results were clear. Meredith and her allies were out. The announcement was met with cheers. People clapped, hugged, and for the first time in years, there was a sense of relief. The oppressive weight of arbitrary fines and power-hungry enforcement was gone. Meredith stood frozen, her carefully curated world crumbling around her. She had ruled through fear, but fear no longer held sway here. Greg stepped forward, his voice firm. As of now, this board is dissolved. A new election will be held to form a governing body that actually represents the people who live here. Carla added, and the first order of business? Reviewing every single fine and rule this HOA ever put in place. The crowd erupted into applause. Meredith turned on her heel and stormed off, Richard trailing behind her. Whatever they had planned, it had failed. Later that evening, As the sun dipped below the horizon, Delilah and I sat on the porch again. The air felt lighter, the neighborhood quieter in a way that spoke of peace rather than tension. She leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly. "It's over." I glanced at the ramp leading to our front door, still standing exactly where it belonged. "Yeah, and they'll never pull something like this again." The HOA had tried to wield power where they had none, and they had lost. The neighborhood was finally free.